Welcome to Capitals by Karl Marx. One of the most influential works in the history of economic and social thought, Capital delves deep into the capitalist system, unraveling its mechanisms of production, the dynamics of value and exploitation, and the inherent contradictions that, according to Marx, will lead to its transformation. This book seeks not only to offer a theoretical understanding of capitalism but also to equip you with tools to analyze its effects on society and the economy. As with other significant works, the key to success lies in a deep understanding of the ideas presented, which can serve as a foundation for reflecting on the world around us and the dynamics that define our daily lives. If this content has piqued your interest and you wish to explore more topics related to economics, politics, and social thought, I invite you to subscribe to the Audio Mentors channel. There, you will find more audiobooks and resources to deepen your understanding of these and other aspects of human knowledge. Don't forget to share this book with your friends and loved ones, and continue your journey toward a deeper understanding of the world we inhabit. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the understanding of capitalism. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Introduction to the Theory of Value. In the first chapter of Capital, Karl Marx lays the theoretical groundwork for analyzing the economic dynamics of capitalism, beginning with the commodity and its value. Marx asserts that the commodity is the basic unit of the capitalist system and that its value must be understood in terms of labor. The value of a commodity is not solely determined by its utility, use value, but is deeply tied to the labor required to produce it, which Marx terms exchange value. The commodity, use value and exchange value. According to Marx, the commodity, which is the object of exchange in capitalism, has two main aspects. Use value. This refers to the material nature of the commodity, its utility in satisfying a need. Use value is independent of the market and pertains to what the commodity can do. A classic example is a coat, whose utility lies in keeping the wearer warm. Every commodity has a use value tied to its function in everyday life. Exchange value. This concerns the exchangeability of a commodity for another. In a capitalist economy, commodities are not exchanged directly for their utility, use value, but for their exchange value, the worth they can achieve in the market. Marx argues that in capitalism, exchange value dominates, as the exchange of commodities drives the economy. While the use value of a commodity is important in daily life, exchange value is the engine of the capitalist system, which focuses not on immediate human needs but on exchange relations and the accumulation of value. The capitalist market's primary objective is not to directly fulfill people's needs but to generate exchange and monetary value. Labor as the measure of value. A cornerstone of Marx's value theory is the idea that the exchange value of a commodity is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor required to produce it. Marx defines this as socially necessary labor time, meaning the value of a commodity depends not on the individual effort of a producer but on the average labor required to produce it under normal production conditions. Marx builds on the classical economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, who also linked labor to value. However, Marx distinguishes himself by emphasizing socially necessary labor. For Marx, labor is the essence of exchange value, and everything in the capitalist economy can be traced to the labor embedded in commodities. This forms the basis of his critique of capitalism, where value is not measured by human needs but by the labor embodied in commodities. The commodity's dual nature. Marx describes the commodity as an object with a dual nature, use value and exchange value. This duality is central to understanding how the capitalist economy operates. Use value. This aspect of a commodity satisfies a direct human need. For example, a pair of shoes has use value because it protects and comforts the feet. Use value is tangible and evident in commodities. Exchange value. In a capitalist economy, this is the primary focus. Exchange value refers to a commodity's ability to be traded for others in the market and has nothing to do with its immediate utility. This value is measured by the amount of other commodities it can secure through exchange. Marx argues that this dual nature of commodities gives rise to the fetishism of commodities, a key concept in his analysis of capitalism. Fetishism refers to the way commodities in the capitalist system seem to have intrinsic value unrelated to the labor that produced them. In essence, capitalism obscures the social relations of production, making commodities appear as if they have value independent of the workers who created them. The fetishism of commodities. The fetishism of commodities is a central concept in Marx's critique of capitalism. He contends that the capitalist system makes commodities appear as if they inherently possess value, when, in reality, their value stems from the labor invested in them. This fetishism is essential for sustaining capitalism because it conceals the social relations of exploitation underlying production. When commodities are exchanged in the market, neither capitalists nor consumers see the human labor behind them. Instead, they perceive them as objects with intrinsic value. This creates an impersonal relationship between producers and consumers, as what is exchanged are commodities, not direct human interactions. Marx argues that this fetishism masks the inherent exploitation of the capitalist system. Workers who produce value do not receive the full value of their labor. Instead, the capitalist appropriates the surplus value, the difference between the value workers create and their wages, perpetuating systemic inequalities. By exposing how labor is the true source of value, Marx seeks to dismantle this illusion and reveal the power dynamics and exploitation embedded in the capitalist system. Conclusion: the commodity as a starting point. This first chapter establishes the foundation for Marx's analysis of capitalism. The commodity, with its use value and exchange value, becomes the basic unit of the capitalist economy. Understanding how the value of a commodity is determined by labor is key to comprehending how the system operates. Additionally, the fetishism of commodities helps us grasp how capitalism conceals social relations of exploitation through the appearance of commodities as autonomous objects. Marx's theory of value is fundamental not only for understanding capitalism but also for recognizing its contradictions and long-term effects on social and economic relations. This approach sets the stage for a deeper analysis of the dynamics of production, distribution, and capital accumulation in subsequent chapters. Chapter 2: Money and Commodities. In this chapter, Marx expands his analysis of commodities and the capitalist economy, introducing the fundamental role of money in the process of exchange and the realization of the value of commodities. For Marx, money is not merely a medium of exchange but a means of measuring the value of commodities, facilitating the process of capital accumulation. The role of money in the capitalist economy. According to Marx, money plays a crucial role in the capitalist economy. It acts as an intermediary in the exchange of commodities, allowing their value to be expressed in a common form. Through money, commodities can be exchanged for one another, facilitating the circulation of capital. Money, therefore, is not just a medium for exchanging goods. It has a deeper significance. It becomes the measure of the value of all commodities. This value, which in the capitalist system is determined by the socially necessary labor required to produce them, is realized only through market exchange, with money serving as the vehicle for this crystallization of value. The transformation of commodities into money. Marx observes that commodities are bought and sold not only for their use value but also for their exchange value, which is realized only when the commodity is sold. Money is thus necessary for commodities to realize their value. By selling, the commodity is converted into money, which can then be reinvested into new commodities to continue the cycle. This process is fundamental to the accumulation of capital in the capitalist system. When the capitalist purchases labor power, the most important commodity in the capitalist economy, with money, that commodity is transformed into value, which is realized only when the product of that labor is exchanged for money again. The fetishism of commodities and money. Like commodities, money also possesses a fetishistic character in capitalism. This means that, in the capitalist system, money is treated as an object with intrinsic value, disconnected from the labor relations that create it. Marx describes how people, in their relationship with money, cease to see the social relations of production and begin to treat money as something autonomous, with value independent of human labor. According to Marx, this fetishism obscures the exploitative relations underlying capitalist production. Commodities appear to have value in themselves, but in reality, it is human labor that generates the value of both commodities and money. Thus, money, like commodities, acquires an illusory power that masks the social relations that enable the accumulation of capital and the exploitation of workers. The role of money in capital accumulation. Money also has a key function in capital accumulation. By exchanging money for commodities, the capitalist seeks not merely to satisfy needs but to accumulate more capital. This process, which Marx describes as the money-commodity-money cycle, is the fundamental mechanism of capitalism. The capitalist invests money in the production process, produces commodities, and then sells them to obtain more money. This cycle of accumulation is the basis of capitalism, as the capitalist continuously reinvests in production to obtain more capital. Through this cycle, the capitalist not only exchanges commodities but also increases wealth, as the sale of commodities is always oriented toward obtaining more money than was initially invested. Thus, money serves not only as a means of exchange but also as the engine of capitalist expansion and accumulation. Money and the exploitation of labor. The relationship between money and labor is central to Marx's critique of capitalism. In capitalism, the capitalist purchases the labor power of workers in exchange for a wage, but the value the worker produces with their labor exceeds the value of their wages. This difference is surplus value, which Marx considers the source of capitalist exploitation. By investing money in the purchase of labor, the capitalist extracts more value from this labor than is paid, enabling profit. This process of extracting surplus value is the foundation of capital accumulation and, according to Marx, the mechanism by which capitalists enrich themselves at the expense of workers. The money-commodity-money cycle. Marx describes the money-commodity-money cycle as the defining process of the capitalist economy. Unlike exchanges of commodities between consumers, where use value is exchanged, the capitalist cycle focuses on exchanging money for commodities to obtain more money. The capitalist is not interested in consuming commodities but in generating profit. This cycle perpetuates the accumulation of capital, further intensifying exploitative relations. Marx demonstrates how this cycle of capital and commodity circulation expands endlessly, concentrating capital in the hands of a few, exacerbating inequalities and the contradictions of the capitalist system. Conclusion. This chapter establishes that money not only facilitates the exchange of commodities but also serves as the means for capital accumulation. Marx's analysis reveals how money and commodities, though they appear to have independent value, are deeply tied to labor relations and exploitation. Money becomes a form of power that obscures the social relations of production and perpetuates the exploitation of workers, ensuring the continuous expansion of capitalism. Marx emphasizes that the circulation of money and commodities is not merely an economic process but also a manifestation of the power and exploitation relations that define capitalism. This analysis is key to understanding how the capitalist system maintains its dynamic of accumulation and concentration of capital through the exploitation of the working class. Labor as the source of value. For Marx, all value is created by human labor. A commodity derives its exchange value from the socially necessary labor invested in its production. In other words, the value of a commodity does not depend on its utility but on the labor required to produce it under normal social conditions. This is the foundation of Marx's labor theory of value, which holds that labor is the fundamental principle that gives commodities their value in the capitalist economy. Marx is interested not only in the concrete labor performed but also in abstract labor. This concept of abstract labor refers to labor in general, without regard to specialization or specific activities. Abstract labor is what creates the exchange value of all commodities, regardless of whether it involves the production of consumer goods or industrial machinery. Capitalist production of commodities. In a capitalist economy, the production of commodities is organized not to meet human needs but to generate profits. The capitalist does not produce commodities out of a desire to fulfill needs but because these commodities are expected to sell in the market, yielding monetary returns that can be reinvested in production to generate more capital. Capitalist production, therefore, is not centered on the direct utility of commodities but on the creation of value that can be realized through exchange. The capitalist buys labor power, uses it to produce commodities, and then sells these commodities for money, which is reinvested in purchasing more labor power and expanding the productive process. This process is essential to understanding how capitalism functions. Production is oriented toward the accumulation of capital. The division of labor and commodity production. In capitalism, the division of labor is a key feature of commodity production. Labor is divided into specialized tasks to increase efficiency and maximize output. The division of labor allows workers to specialize in specific tasks, which in turn increases productivity and reduces costs. However, this specialization also has alienating effects, as workers are reduced to performing a single repetitive task, limiting their creativity and autonomy. Marx argues that the division of labor in capitalism not only increases efficiency but also reinforces social inequality by separating workers from the means of production and reducing them to mere executors of tasks without control over the overall production process. Capital and the production of surplus value. The central goal of capitalism is the production of surplus value, which Marx describes as the difference between the value produced by labor and the amount the worker receives as wages. The capitalist purchases labor power for a specific value, the wage, and, in doing so, appropriates a portion of the value created by the worker. Surplus value is the source of capitalist profit and is fundamental to the expansion of capital. Marx distinguishes between two forms of producing surplus value: absolute surplus value and relative surplus value. Absolute surplus value is generated by extending the working day, allowing the capitalist to extract more labor from workers without increasing wages. Relative surplus value is generated by improving labor productivity through the introduction of new technologies or organizational methods, enabling the capitalist to extract more value from workers without extending their working time. The cycle of capital production and circulation. The capitalist production process consists of a continuous cycle in which the capitalist invests money to produce commodities that are then sold for more money. This money-commodity-money cycle is the engine of capitalism, as it allows capital to accumulate and be continuously reinvested. Commodity production is not merely an act of value creation but a process tied to the circulation of capital. Marx emphasizes that this cycle is not limited to the production of commodities but is intrinsically linked to the circulation of money. Capital is not only invested in producing commodities but also circulates through the market, enabling capitalists to generate profits and continue accumulating wealth. The contradiction in commodity production. Marx points out that there is an inherent contradiction in the capitalist production of commodities. On one hand, production is organized to generate wealth and accumulate capital, but on the other, this production is not directed at meeting human needs. Commodities are produced not for consumption but for exchange as money. This contradiction leads to periodic crises in capitalism, as commodities are overproduced but cannot always be sold to consumers. Marx observes that this contradiction between production and consumption is one of the fundamental sources of economic crises in capitalism. The cycle of production and circulation of capital generates periods of expansion followed by recessions, reflecting the inherent instability of the system. The alienation of the worker. The process of commodity production is also tied to the alienation of the worker. In capitalism, workers do not own the means of production, placing them in a position of dependence on the capitalist. Workers are reduced to being just another commodity in the production process, and their labor becomes alienated, that is, it is not recognized as a creative activity but as a repetitive and impersonal task. Alienation, for Marx, is one of the most fundamental characteristics of capitalism, as it prevents workers from fully realizing themselves through their labor. The relationship between the worker and production becomes dehumanized, and workers lose control over the product of their labor. Conclusion. The chapter on commodity production establishes that capitalism is organized around the creation of value through labor. Commodities, money, labor, and capital are interconnected in a system that seeks the continuous accumulation of wealth. However, this production process is marked by contradictions and exploitative relationships that limit workers' well-being and generate economic crises. Marx uses the analysis of commodity production to unravel the dynamics of power and exploitation in capitalism, laying the groundwork for a deeper exploration of capital accumulation, wealth concentration, and class struggle, which he examines in subsequent chapters. Chapter 4. The Capitalist Production Process. In this chapter, Marx delves into how capitalism organizes the production process and how labor, capital, and the means of production interrelate to generate value and surplus value. This process is the core of the capitalist economy, where the central goal is the production of surplus value, that is, the creation of additional value that is not paid to the worker, but appropriated by the capitalist. Marx explains how the capitalist transforms labor into a commodity, extracting more value than they pay the worker, thereby generating the basis of exploitation in the capitalist system. Labor as the fundamental element of production. In capitalism, labor becomes a commodity. Workers sell their labor power to the capitalist, who uses it to produce commodities. The work process is therefore a social process of value creation. The worker does not own the means of production and is thus forced to sell their capacity to work, which becomes a commodity exchanged in the labor market. Marx explains that labor itself is the engine of capitalist production, as it is the only factor that can generate value. The means of production, such as machines, factories, and land, do not create value on their own. Only human labor can transform natural resources and means of production into commodities with exchange value. The relationship between labor and capital. Marx emphasizes that in the capitalist economy, labor and capital are deeply interrelated, but also in conflict. The capitalist buys the worker's labor power for a specified wage, but this wage only covers part of the value created by the worker. The remainder of that value, which the worker does not receive, is what Marx calls surplus value, and it is appropriated by the capitalist. The capitalist invests capital in purchasing the means of production and labor power. The means of production, such as factories and tools, serve to transform materials into products. However, the real value of the products does not come from the means of production but from the human labor used to transform them. Therefore, labor is the factor that adds value to the production process, while capital, in the form of money, machinery, and means of production, merely serves as a means to organize production. The process of surplus value production. The capitalist's goal in the production process is to create surplus value. To achieve this, the capitalist uses the worker's labor power, which produces commodities whose value exceeds the wages they receive in exchange for their labor. The difference between the value created by the worker and the wage they receive is surplus value. Marx distinguishes between two main forms of generating surplus value. Absolute surplus value, generated by extending the working day, allowing the worker to work longer hours, creating more value without additional compensation. The capitalist can extend the working day beyond what is necessary to reproduce the value of labor power, thereby extracting more value from the worker without paying them more. Relative surplus value, generated when the capitalist increases labor productivity, either through the introduction of new technologies, improved production methods, or more efficient organization of labor. By increasing productivity, the capitalist can reduce the time required to produce a commodity, freeing up additional time for the production of surplus value without increasing the working day. Marx observes that in capitalism, the production process is organized in such a way that it always seeks to maximize surplus value. This leads to a constant drive to increase the working day, absolute surplus value, or productivity, relative surplus value, which perpetuates the exploitation of workers. Constant capital and variable capital. Marx introduces the distinction between two forms of capital in the production process: constant capital and variable capital. Constant capital, the capital invested in the means of production, machinery, raw materials, tools. This capital does not create value on its own, it simply transfers its value to the commodity during the production process. Variable capital, the capital invested in the purchase of labor power. Variable capital is the one that generates new value, as the worker's labor produces more value than is paid in wages. This is the only type of capital that creates additional value in the production process, making variable capital the source of surplus value. Marx argues that the capitalist seeks to maximize the proportion of variable capital relative to constant capital because variable capital produces surplus value. An increase in the proportion of constant capital, through the introduction of machinery and technology, can reduce the amount of labor needed to produce commodities but does not directly increase the amount of surplus value. The law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Marx posits that as capitalism advances, there is a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. This occurs because capitalists invest more in constant capital, technology, and machinery to increase productivity, which reduces the amount of labor required to produce commodities. Since labor is the source of value, if the amount of labor required decreases, the amount of surplus value generated by capital also decreases. This phenomenon creates a contradiction within capitalism. While productivity and capital accumulation increase, the rate of profit tends to fall. This, in turn, creates periodic economic crises, as capitalists face difficulties in generating profits as they invest more in machines and technology but still require human labor to generate value. Exploitation and the accumulation of capital. Marx concludes that the capitalist production process is structured to maximize the exploitation of labor and the accumulation of capital. The capitalist uses the worker's labor power to generate more value than is paid in wages, and this process of surplus value extraction allows capital to accumulate. Capital is not just a tool for production but a means to generate more capital, creating a dynamic of constant economic growth dependent on the exploitation of workers. However, Marx also points out that this process of capital accumulation is not sustainable in the long term. The internal contradictions of capitalism, such as the tendency for the rate of profit to fall and the concentration of capital in the hands of a few, lead to economic crises that are inevitable in the capitalist system. Conclusion. This chapter is essential to understanding how the capitalist production process works and how the capitalist generates surplus value through the exploitation of labor. Human labor is the source of value in capitalism, but the capitalist appropriates a portion of that value through surplus value extraction. As capital advances and more is invested in technology, the capitalist system faces inherent contradictions that, according to Marx, will lead to its eventual crisis. The capitalist production process is not oriented toward meeting human needs but toward the accumulation of capital. This chapter lays the groundwork for understanding the dynamics of power, exploitation, and accumulation that Marx will develop in the following chapters. Chapter 5. The Formula of Capital. In this chapter, Marx examines the formula of capital in its most basic form and explains how it becomes the driving force of the capitalist system. The basic formula of capital is a cycle that involves the purchase of commodities, their production, and their sale to generate profits. Marx highlights how capital is not just a medium of exchange, but also a means to generate more capital, driving a continuous cycle of accumulation. The basic formula of capital. The formula for the circulation of capital is represented as follows. Money to commodity to money. This can be understood as the process in which the capitalist starts with a sum of money, buys commodities, mainly labor power and means of production, produces more commodities, and then sells them for more money than they originally invested, thereby generating a profit. This cycle is not just an exchange of commodities but reflects the accumulative nature of capital. Money, commodity, money indicates that the capitalist does not buy commodities to consume them, but with the intention of selling them at a higher price, thus making a profit. The difference between the initial money and the final money, which Marx calls money, is the profit obtained through the sale of commodities. This process reflects the dynamic of capital accumulation in capitalism. Money as a means of accumulation. Marx emphasizes that money in the capitalist system plays a crucial role beyond its function as a medium of exchange. The capitalist does not settle for spending their money on consumption. Instead, they invest it in the production process. This process of investing in the purchase of commodities and subsequently selling them at a higher price generates an expansion of capital. In this way, money becomes the means through which capital self-expands. Marx notes that this process of investment and accumulation continues cyclically. Each time the capitalist gains profits from selling commodities, they reinvest that capital in more production, creating a perpetual cycle of wealth accumulation. The capitalist system, therefore, is not based solely on the production of commodities for consumption, but on the constant expansion of capital. This expansion is the essence of capitalism and what drives it. The transformation of money into capital. Marx explains how money, in the capitalist system, transforms into capital. Capital, unlike simple money, has a special function. It seeks to generate more value. Money becomes capital when it is used to purchase labor power and means of production, which are then combined to generate more value in the form of commodities that will be sold for more money. This transformation process, according to Marx, is what allows capitalism to be based on constant accumulation. Through the purchase of labor and means of production, the capitalist creates more value than they initially invested, generating profits that are reinvested to allow capital to grow. In this way, money becomes a means to obtain more money, reinforcing the expansive nature of capital. The production of surplus value through capital. The essence of the formula of capital is not only in the circulation of money, but in how surplus value is produced. The capitalist, by investing in labor power, which is purchased for money, obtains more value than they pay in wages. This additional value is surplus value, which is the basis of capitalist profits. Marx explains that the process of surplus value extraction is not an exchange of commodities for their real value, but involves the appropriation of the difference between what the worker creates, the value of the commodities, and what they receive in the form of wages. This difference is appropriated by the capitalist and constitutes the basis of their profit. Surplus value is what enables the expansion of capital. Without the extraction of surplus value, the capitalist could not reinvest in the production process, and therefore there would be no accumulation of capital. Marx highlights that this process of exploiting labor is what sustains the entire capitalist system, as it allows for the continuous reproduction and expansion of capital. The dynamics of capital and its expansion. The process of capital circulation, represented in the formula money commodity money, has an internal dynamic aimed at maximizing accumulation. For Marx, this accumulation cycle is infinite. As the capitalist reinvests the profits obtained, they seek new ways to increase production and surplus value extraction, often through the intensification of labor, reducing labor costs, or introducing new technologies. The formula also reflects capitalism's tendency to concentrate wealth in the hands of a few, as those who are most successful in capital accumulation have the means to reinvest on a larger scale, while those with less capital fall behind. This leads to an increasing concentration of wealth and power, which Marx sees as an inherent contradiction within the capitalist system. Capital as a social relation. Marx emphasizes that capital is not just a physical object, money, machinery, etc., but a social relation. Capital is ultimately based on the exploitation of labor. Money and commodities do not have value by themselves, but because they are embedded in a network of social relations where workers produce value and capitalists appropriate it. In this sense, the formula of capital not only describes an economic process but also reflects the power and control relationships that define capitalism. The capitalist has control over the production process, which allows them to appropriate the surplus value generated by the labor of workers. This control and the exploitation of human labor are the foundation of capitalist accumulation. The contradiction of capital. Marx points out that the formula of capital, which seems like an endless process of accumulation, is marked by internal contradictions. On one hand, capitalism is designed to expand capital continuously, but on the other hand, it generates inequalities and tensions that can lead to economic crises. These crises, according to Marx, are inherent to capitalism due to the contradictions between the production of commodities and the society's capacity to consume them. The expansion of capital often leads to overproduction, meaning the production of more commodities than can be consumed, which creates imbalances in the market and, eventually, economic recessions. Conclusion. The formula of capital explains the basic process of accumulation in the capitalist system, where the capitalist invests money in the purchase of labor power and means of production, produces commodities, and then sells them to obtain more money. This cycle of money-commodity money is the foundation of the continuous expansion of capital. Through the extraction of surplus value, the capitalist obtains profits, and this accumulation process drives the capitalist system. However, the inherent contradictions of capitalism, such as overproduction and the concentration of wealth, generate periodic crises that reveal the system's unsustainability in the long run. Marx uses this formula to show how the exploitation of labor is the engine of capitalism and how, through accumulation, the system perpetuates social and economic inequalities. Chapter 6. The Production of Surplus Value. In this chapter, Marx analyzes in detail the notion of surplus value, which is the basis of exploitation in the capitalist system. The production of surplus value is the mechanism by which the capitalist obtains profits from the labor of workers. Marx breaks down how this surplus value is created in the production process, as well as the different ways in which it can be maximized by the capitalist, often at the cost of the working class. The origin of surplus value. Marx argues that surplus value is not an additional value derived from commodities or means of production, but rather it is created by human labor. Labor is the only source of value, and the capitalist obtains surplus value by paying less for the labor power than what the worker actually produces. When the capitalist buys the labor power of workers, they pay a wage for a set period of time. However, the value that workers create during their workday exceeds the wage they receive. The difference between the value created by the worker and the wage they receive is the surplus value, which the capitalist appropriates. Surplus value is, therefore, the result of the exploitation of labor, as the capitalist pays the worker only part of the value they have produced. Marx argues that this is the heart of the capitalist system. Workers produce the value but do not receive the full value of their work. The difference between the value produced and the value received as wages is appropriated by the capitalist as profit. Absolute and relative surplus value. Marx makes a distinction between two ways of producing surplus value: absolute surplus value and relative surplus value. Absolute surplus value. This refers to the generation of surplus value through the extension of the workday. The longer a worker works, the more surplus value is extracted from their labor. In this case, the capitalist does not change the conditions of production but simply extends the amount of time the workers are working to generate more value without increasing their wage. Relative surplus value. This is generated when the capitalist increases labor productivity. This is mainly achieved by introducing new technologies or improvements in the organization of labor. By making workers produce more in less time, the capitalist can reduce the time needed to produce a commodity, freeing up additional time to extract more surplus value. In other words, the workday remains the same, but more surplus value is achieved in less time by improving labor efficiency. Both types of surplus value are essential to the functioning of capitalism, as they allow capitalists to extract more value from labor without proportionally increasing workers' wages. The pursuit of both absolute and relative surplus value is ultimately what drives competition among capitalists and the expansion of production. Work time and the workday. Marx also focuses on the relationship between work time and surplus value. The length of the workday is key to the amount of surplus value that can be extracted from workers. The longer the workday, the more surplus value the worker can generate. In this sense, the capitalist is incentivized to prolong the workday to maximize the time during which workers produce value. The expansion of the workday to generate absolute surplus value was a common feature in the early stages of capitalism, where workers were forced to work long hours without proportional compensation. However, as capitalism advanced, capitalists began to seek ways to generate relative surplus value through technological innovation, which allowed for increased production without the need to extend the workday. The law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. A key concept in Marx's analysis of the production of surplus value is the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. This law holds that as the capitalist invests more in machinery and technology, i.e., in constant capital, the amount of human labor required to produce commodities tends to decrease. Since labor is the only source of value, this reduces the amount of surplus value generated by capital. As the proportion of constant capital in relation to variable capital, investment in labor power, increases, the capitalist tends to experience a fall in the rate of profit. Although productivity may increase, the value created by labor decreases, leading to a structural crisis in the capitalist system. This fall in the rate of profit can lead to economic slowdowns, financial crises, and intensified competition among capitalists to maintain profits. The exploitation of workers and the concentration of capital. Marx points out that the production of surplus value leads to the concentration of capital in the hands of a few, which increases the exploitation of workers. As capitalists reinvest profits to expand production and increase constant capital, technology and machinery, workers are displaced, and their power in the labor market is reduced. The accumulation of capital leads to greater concentration of wealth, creating growing inequality between capitalists and workers. This concentration also means that fewer capitalists control a larger proportion of total capital, leading to increased competition and, in turn, greater exploitation of the labor force. The relationship between labor and capital in the production of surplus value. Marx also emphasizes that the production of surplus value is directly related to the power relationship between capital and labor. In capitalism, the capitalist has control over the means of production and, therefore, over the labor process. Workers, on the other hand, are alienated from the production process and have no control over what they produce or the conditions of their work. The appropriation of surplus value by the capitalist is based on this unequal power relationship, where the worker is a commodity that produces more value than they receive in the form of wages. This inequality is the core of exploitation in capitalism and the source of the social tensions that Marx identifies as inevitable features of the capitalist system. Conclusion. The chapter on the production of surplus value is central to understanding how the capitalist economy works and how the capitalist generates profits through the exploitation of labor. Surplus value, whether in its absolute or relative form, is the source of capital accumulation. Marx shows how capitalists, by extracting more value from labor than they pay in wages, perpetuate a system of exploitation that benefits one class and harms another. The law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and the increasing concentration of capital reflect the internal contradictions of capitalism, which Marx argues lead to its eventual crisis. This analysis of the production of surplus value sets the stage for understanding how capital accumulates and is distributed in the capitalist system, and how power and exploitation relations are fundamental to the economic dynamics. Chapter 7. The concept of absolute and relative surplus value. In this chapter, Marx delves into the concepts of absolute surplus value and relative surplus value, which are essential for understanding how capitalists generate profits by exploiting workers. These two types of surplus value not only show how more value is extracted from labor but also illustrate the different ways in which capitalists seek to maximize their profits over time. Furthermore, Marx examines how the intensification of labor exploitation and technological innovation play a crucial role in the creation of surplus value. Absolute surplus value. Absolute surplus value is generated when the capitalist increases the workday of workers without proportionally increasing their wages. By extending the workday, the capitalist ensures that workers continue to produce goods beyond what is needed to reproduce their labor power. This means that the worker continues to generate value without receiving additional compensation for that extra time. For Marx, this is one of the most direct and primitive methods of extracting surplus value. The capitalist can increase the amount of absolute surplus value simply by extending the working time, without needing to change production methods or improve productivity. This reflects the direct exploitation of the worker's labor power, where they work more hours than what is necessary to cover the cost of their wages. Relative surplus value. Relative surplus value, on the other hand, is generated when the capitalist increases labor productivity through technological improvements, changes in the organization of work, or the introduction of new production methods. By improving the efficiency with which workers produce goods, the capitalist reduces the time required to produce an amount of value equivalent to the worker's wage. This frees up time within the workday in which the worker continues to produce goods that are not directly compensated, thus generating additional surplus value. Increasing productivity, whether through the use of machinery or the reorganization of the production process, allows the capitalist to extract more value from workers without the need to extend the workday. This is a more sophisticated mechanism for extracting surplus value that can generate greater profits in the long term without resorting to the direct exploitation of working hours. Marx views relative surplus value as a process closely tied to technological development and competition among capitalists. By constantly seeking ways to reduce costs and increase production, capitalists introduce technological innovations that enable more value to be created in a shorter time frame. The relationship between absolute and relative surplus value. Although the two types of surplus value may seem distinct, Marx argues that they are inherently related. Absolute surplus value, generated by extending the workday, is more common in the early stages of capitalism, while relative surplus value, produced by improving productivity, becomes the dominant form as capitalism progresses. According to Marx, relative surplus value is in constant expansion due to competition among capitalists, who are always searching for ways to innovate to increase efficiency and reduce production costs. Technological innovation, for example, allows capitalists to maintain profits even if the workday does not extend beyond legal limits. Absolute and relative surplus value reflect the two fundamental forms of exploitation in capitalism, one based on increasing the duration of labor and the other on intensifying labor. Both methods complement each other and work together to maximize the accumulation of capital in the hands of capitalists. Competition and intensification of exploitation. Marx points out that as capitalists seek to maximize surplus value, competition among them intensifies. Capitalists who manage to reduce production costs by improving productivity gain a competitive advantage over those who do not. This constant competition drives technological innovation and the reorganization of labor, which in turn allows for greater extraction of relative surplus value. However, this competition also has negative effects for workers. As capitalists attempt to maximize productivity, they increase the intensification of labor, which can lead to greater exploitation of workers. The pressure to produce more in less time can result in harsher working conditions and greater alienation. Capital accumulation and expansion of the system. The increase in productivity and the extraction of relative surplus value allow for the expansion of capital in the capitalist system. By reducing production costs and increasing profits, the capitalist can reinvest in production and continue the accumulation cycle. This cycle is essential for the reproduction of capitalism, as it allows capitalists to keep accumulating wealth, which in turn fuels economic growth. However, this process also generates contradictions within the system. As capital accumulates, it becomes concentrated in the hands of a few capitalists, creating growing social inequality. At the same time, workers continue to be exploited, as the value they produce is not reflected in their wages. Growing inequality and exploitation are fundamental characteristics of capitalism that Marx examines in detail throughout Capital. The long workday and the struggle for the reduction of the working hours. In this chapter, Marx also highlights how the struggle for the reduction of the working day is a direct response to the extraction of absolute surplus value. As workers organize to demand better working conditions, the reduction of the working day becomes a central demand. However, the capitalist always seeks to maximize the amount of surplus value they can extract, which creates tensions between the classes. The struggle for a shorter workday is one of the manifestations of class struggle within the capitalist system. While capitalists seek to extend the workday to generate more surplus value, workers fight to shorten the workday and improve their living conditions. Marx sees this contradiction as a manifestation of the inherent exploitation in the capitalist system, where the interests of capitalists and workers are in direct conflict. Conclusion. The chapter on absolute and relative surplus value explains how the capitalist maximizes their profits through the exploitation of workers. Absolute surplus value is obtained by extending the workday, while relative surplus value is generated through the intensification of labor and the increase of productivity. Both methods are related and work together to maximize capital accumulation. Marx emphasizes that this process of surplus value extraction is the foundation of capitalist accumulation but is also a constant source of contradictions and social tensions. The struggle for better working conditions, the reduction of the workday, and the more equitable distribution of the fruits of labor are some of the social responses to the inherent exploitation of capitalism. Chapter 8: Working Time and the Workday. In this chapter, Marx explores the relationship between working time and the creation of surplus value, a key concept for understanding the exploitation of labor in capitalism. The duration of the workday, according to Marx, is a crucial factor in the amount of surplus value capitalists can extract from workers. This chapter also addresses the historical struggle for the reduction of the workday and how this struggle reflects the contradictions within the capitalist system. Working time as a measure of value. Marx begins this chapter by reaffirming that labor is the source of value in the capitalist economy. However, working time, and specifically the time that the worker spends producing more value than they receive in wages, surplus value, plays a central role in capitalist production. Working time is essential for determining the amount of value the worker creates. According to Marx, in a capitalist system, the working time that exceeds the time necessary to reproduce the value of labor power, the wage, is the time during which surplus value is produced. In other words, the capitalist seeks to maximize the time in which workers produce value without receiving proportional compensation. This is the basis of exploitation in capitalism. The workday and exploitation. The workday is a key concept in the capitalist system because it determines how much time workers are available to produce additional value, surplus value. Marx argues that the longer the workday, the greater the amount of surplus value extracted from the worker, since the workday exceeds the time required to produce the value equivalent to the wage. For example, if a worker produces goods whose total value is twice what they earn in wages during a workday, the difference, surplus value, is appropriated by the capitalist. If the workday is extended, the worker continues to produce more value than they receive in wages, thus generating more surplus value for the capitalist. The long workday, a method of extracting absolute surplus value. Marx explains that the extension of the workday is one of the most direct and traditional methods of extracting absolute surplus value. This method was common in the early stages of capitalism, when capitalists did not rely so much on productivity and technology, but on simply extending the workday to generate more value. The extension of the workday without a proportional increase in wages allows capitalists to increase their profits, as workers continue to produce value during the additional time. Through this exploitation, capitalists maximize the extraction of surplus value. The long workday and class struggle. Marx observes that the extension of the workday is not just an economic phenomenon but also a political and social issue that is at the heart of the class struggle. The working class, throughout history, has fought against the exploitation arising from long workdays. The struggle for the reduction of the workday is a manifestation of workers' resistance to inhuman working conditions. As capitalism advanced, especially with industrialization, working conditions became increasingly harsh. The long workday not only generated an excess of economic exploitation but also contributed to the alienation of workers, who spent a significant part of their lives working, with no control over the production process or the product of their labor. The reduction of the workday, a historical process. Marx points out that the reduction of the workday is not a process that occurs spontaneously within capitalism, but rather a conquest of the working class through struggle. In the early days of capitalism, capitalists sought to extend the workday as much as possible, while workers were forced to work long hours under extreme conditions. The struggle for the reduction of the workday is one of the first forms of organized resistance against capitalist exploitation. Marx describes how workers have fought throughout history for labor rights, such as the 8-hour workday, which later became a standard in many countries. However, the struggle is not merely for free time, but for the redistribution of working time, allowing workers to have control over their lives and their work. The law of the reduction of the workday and relative surplus value. In this context, the struggle for the reduction of the workday is linked to the concept of relative surplus value. As workers fight for a shorter workday, The capitalist may seek new ways to increase productivity to maintain or increase surplus value without relying on the extension of the workday. This is achieved through the introduction of new technologies and improvements in the organization of work, which allow workers to produce more in less time. Through the reduction of the workday, workers gain more time for themselves and potentially for personal development, while capitalists, on the other hand, increase the efficiency and productivity of the workforce to continue maximizing relative surplus value. This dynamic reflects how struggles for better working conditions are often a direct response to capitalist exploitation and a way to rebalance the relationship between labor and capital. The long workday and the critique of alienation. The long workday is also seen by Marx as a source of alienation. The worker becomes an extension of the production machine, being forced to sell their time and energy to generate more value for the capitalist. The time the worker spends on production is not time that belongs to them. Rather, it becomes time that the capitalist appropriates through the extraction of surplus value. The alienation of the worker is a central feature of capitalism, where workers lose control over the product of their labor, the way their time is organized, and the production process itself. Marx believes that only through the reduction of the workday and the organization of work according to human needs, not capitalist profit, can the alienation of labor begin to be overcome. Conclusion. The chapter on working time and the workday is crucial to understanding the exploitation of labor in capitalism. Marx demonstrates how the length of the workday is a key factor in the extraction of surplus value and how the workers' struggle for a shorter workday reflects resistance to exploitation and alienation. Furthermore, Marx links the reduction of the workday with increased productivity through technological innovation, allowing capitalists to continue extracting relative surplus value. This chapter highlights the inherent tensions within the capitalist system, where the pursuit of profit through the exploitation of labor clashes with the struggles for better living and working conditions, which are part of the fundamental contradiction that defines capitalism. Chapter 9. The Organic Composition of Capital. In this chapter, Marx analyzes the organic composition of capital, a fundamental concept for understanding how capital is organized and how investments in labor and machinery, constant and variable capital, interact to generate surplus value. The organic composition of capital describes the relationship between constant capital, invested in means of production like machinery, tools, and raw materials, and variable capital, invested in labor power, i.e., workers' wages. The distinction between constant and variable capital. Marx begins the chapter by explaining the difference between constant and variable capital. Constant capital. This is capital invested in the means of production, such as machinery, equipment, raw materials, and other tools used in production. This capital does not create value by itself. It merely transfers its value to the product in process. It is the value that is transferred from the means of production to the goods during the manufacturing process. Variable capital. This is capital invested in the purchase of labor power. Marx argues that it is the only type of capital that generates new value, as human labor is the only source of additional value. The worker produces more value than they receive in wages, and the difference between what the capitalist pays the worker and what the worker produces is surplus value. The organic composition of capital. The organic composition of capital refers to the relationship between constant capital and variable capital in the production process. Marx describes that, in capitalism, as productivity and technologies advance, capitalists tend to increase the proportion of constant capital relative to variable capital. This means more is invested in machinery, technology, and other means of production, while the proportion of workers, variable capital, decreases. This trend is a central feature of capitalism, where the capitalist seeks to increase productivity through the incorporation of more technology and less human labor. The organic composition of capital reflects how capitalism is moving toward greater automation and rationalization of the production process, often displacing workers in the process. The implication of the organic composition for the rate of profit. One of the most important implications of the organic composition of capital is its relationship to the rate of profit. Marx argues that as the proportion of constant capital increases, the rate of profit tends to decline. This is because constant capital, being no direct source of new value, since it merely transfers its value, does not contribute directly to the increase of surplus value, whereas variable capital, labor, is the only one that can generate new value. In other words, by increasing the proportion of constant capital, machinery, technology, etc., relative to variable capital, labor, the capitalist invests more in resources that do not produce value by themselves, and as a result, the amount of new value generated by each unit of investment tends to decrease. This phenomenon contributes to what Marx calls the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which is one of the inherent contradictions of capitalism. The role of technology in the organic composition. Marx also explores the impact of technology on the organic composition of capital. The introduction of new machines and more efficient production methods increases the amount of constant capital in production, which can reduce the need for human labor, variable capital. However, this technology also has a paradoxical effect. While it increases productivity and reduces production costs, it can also decrease the amount of labor needed to produce goods, which reduces the generation of surplus value. Therefore, constant technological innovation and the introduction of new machines and tools, while increasing efficiency, also tend to reduce the rate of profit by decreasing the amount of living labor involved in production. This becomes a central contradiction of capitalism, where technological advances, rather than guaranteeing increased profit, can generate economic crises and a slowdown in capital accumulation. Technical composition and value composition. Marx distinguishes between technical composition and value composition. Technical composition. This refers to the proportion between constant capital, machinery, equipment, and variable capital, labor power, in the production process. It is a quantitative measure of the means of production used in the production of commodities. Value composition. This refers to the proportion between the value of constant capital and the value of variable capital. As technical composition shifts towards greater investment in machinery and technology, value composition also changes, since constant capital has a greater value than variable capital. Marx argues that the relationship between both compositions is crucial to understanding the dynamics of capitalist accumulation. Value composition reflects how investments in technology and machinery affect the generation of surplus value, while technical composition shows how the capitalist organizes the means of production to maximize efficiency. The accumulation of capital and the tendency toward concentration. The tendency towards greater investment in constant capital leads to the concentration of capital in the hands of a few capitalists. By increasing efficiency and reducing dependence on human labor, the larger capitalists who can afford technological investments gain a competitive advantage. This widens the gap between large and small capitalist enterprises, leading to capital concentration. This phenomenon also has implications for the working class. As capital concentrates, workers face greater alienation and less control over the production process. Automation and mechanization not only displace workers but also reinforce hierarchy and inequality within the capitalist system. The contradiction between labor and capital. Marx concludes the chapter by emphasizing that the relationship between labor and capital is defined by a fundamental contradiction. Constant capital, technology and machinery, tends to replace human labor, while labor remains the only source of value in the capitalist system. This contradiction between constant capital and variable capital reflects the inherent class struggle in capitalism, where capital seeks to minimize human labor and maximize profit at the expense of the working class. Conclusion. The chapter on the organic composition of capital is crucial to understanding how capitalism organizes production and how the capitalist seeks to maximize profits through investment in constant capital and the minimization of variable capital, labor. As the proportion of constant capital increases, the rate of profit tends to decline, creating a contradiction within the system. The struggle for capital accumulation and the constant pursuit of technological innovation, while increasing efficiency, also exacerbate the contradictions of capitalism and lead to economic crises. Chapter 10. The Law of the Tendency of the Rate of Profit to Fall. In this chapter, Marx presents one of the most important and controversial theories in his work, the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. This law holds that as capitalism develops, the rate of profit tends to decline, generating periodic economic crises and reflecting a fundamental contradiction of the capitalist system. Marx considers this law as one of the structural causes of crises and an indication of the long-term unsustainability of capitalism. The emergence of the law. The law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is based on the relationship between two key components of capital: constant capital, invested in machinery, technology, and other means of production, and variable capital, invested in labor power, i.e., workers' wages. Marx argues that in capitalism, capitalists tend to increase the proportion of constant capital relative to variable capital. In other words, they invest more in machinery and technology and less in hiring workers. The increase in the proportion of constant capital reduces the amount of human labor needed in the production process. Since labor is the only source of value, this implies that the amount of value generated by each unit of capital declines over time. As investment in constant capital, machines, technology, intensifies, the rate of profit tends to fall. The long march towards the reduction of the rate of profit. The law implies that as labor productivity increases, thanks to investment in technology and machinery, the amount of living labor, variable capital, in the production process decreases. As the amount of labor needed is reduced, less surplus value is produced in relation to the invested capital. In simple terms, capitalists obtain less additional value for every unit of investment in constant capital. This process generates a tendency towards the decrease of the rate of profit as capitalism progresses. Although capital accumulation may continue due to the expansion of production and cost reduction, the profitability of investment decreases, placing capitalism in a state of internal contradiction. The competition among capitalists to maximize their profits and the need to reduce labor costs to maintain competitiveness creates pressure for the rate of profit to fall. Capital accumulation and wealth concentration. Marx also observes that this tendency of the rate of profit to fall leads to the concentration of capital in the hands of a few capitalists. Capitalists who can afford investment in advanced machinery and technology gain a competitive advantage over those who cannot. This means that large capitalists, those who possess more capital, can take advantage of economies of scale and increase their market share. This process of wealth concentration implies that capital accumulates in the hands of a few large companies, while small businesses are displaced or absorbed. As capital concentrates, so does economic power, increasing inequalities within the capitalist system. Economic crises. Consequence of the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. One of the most important consequences of the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is the emergence of periodic economic crises. As the profitability of capital falls, capitalists face difficulties in achieving sustainable profits, leading to overproduction of goods that cannot be consumed, either due to lack of effective demand or market saturation. These crises of overproduction and profit decline are characteristic of capitalism, and Marx holds that they are inevitable due to the structural contradictions of the system. The tendency of the rate of profit to fall is, therefore, one of the main causes of the cyclical crises that affect capitalism. Each crisis not only reflects the system's inability to expand without limits but also the need for restructuring that allows profitability to be restored through new forms of accumulation. The contradiction between constant and variable capital. One of the fundamental contradictions Marx points out in this law is the tension between constant capital and variable capital. Constant capital, represented by machinery and means of production, cannot generate value by itself. Its value is transferred to the product being made, but it does not create additional value. Variable capital, on the other hand, is the only one that generates new value through labor. As the proportion of constant capital increases, labor is displaced, reducing the amount of new value created by each unit of invested capital. This creates a contradiction within the capitalist system, in which the pursuit of greater efficiency through technology and mechanization reduces the amount of value generated by labor, which in turn affects the rate of profit. The impact of technological innovation and permanent crisis. Marx observes that technological innovations and the constant search for productivity increases not only reduce the amount of labor needed but also increase competitiveness in the market. Capitalists who introduce technological innovations may generate higher profits in the short term, but as these innovations spread, the profitability of capital declines, leading to a crisis of overproduction. This cycle of technological innovation, increased productivity, falling rate of profit, and crisis is characteristic of capitalism. Marx suggests that crises are not mere accidents of the system, but are inherent in the structural contradictions of capitalism. Each crisis provides an opportunity for capital to restructure and restore profitability, but also reinforces inequalities within the system. Conclusion: the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is one of Marx's most important contributions to the analysis of capitalism. This law indicates that as capitalism progresses, the rate of profit tends to decline due to the increase in constant capital relative to variable capital, which reduces the amount of living labor in the production process. This decrease in profitability leads to periodic crises, which are inevitable within the capitalist system. Through this law, Marx explains the internal contradictions of capitalism and its tendency toward crisis. The accumulation of capital and the intensification of exploitation cannot be sustained indefinitely, as the system is marked by contradictions that lead it to a structural crisis. These crises are a manifestation of the inherent tensions within capitalism, which, according to Marx, can only be resolved through a change in the economic and social system. Chapter 11. The Capitalist and the Process of Accumulation. In this chapter, Marx focuses on how the capitalist organizes the accumulation of capital, the process by which capital grows and expands in the capitalist economy. Accumulation is the engine that drives the capitalist system, and it is through this process that the capitalist seeks to increase profits and perpetuate their dominance. Marx examines the dynamics of this process, the ways in which capitalists reinvest profits, and how capital accumulation affects both capitalists and workers. The accumulation of capital, an uninterrupted process. The accumulation of capital is the process by which capitalists reinvest the profits obtained from the production and sale of goods to increase their capital. This process does not stop, as the capitalist is constantly looking for new ways to expand their wealth. Marx argues that the ultimate goal of capital accumulation is to maximize surplus value, that is, to extract more value from human labor. Accumulation occurs when the capitalist uses their profits to buy more means of production, constant capital, and labor power, variable capital, thus increasing the productive capacity of the business. Through this process, the capitalist creates more goods to be sold on the market, which allows them to obtain more money, which they then reinvest to continue the accumulation cycle. This continuous cycle of accumulation is essential for the expansion of capitalism. The expansion of capital and the creation of surplus value. Marx explains that the accumulation process is not only about increasing capital in absolute terms, but also about increasing surplus value. By reinvesting profits in purchasing more labor power and means of production, the capitalist can produce more goods and therefore more surplus value. This surplus value is essential for accumulation, as it is the source of the capitalist's profits. The capitalist always seeks ways to increase surplus value, either by extending the working day, absolute surplus value, or by increasing productivity, relative surplus value. Capital accumulation, therefore, is directly linked to the exploitation of labor. Without the extraction of surplus value, there would be no capital accumulation. Capital and competition among capitalists. Marx observes that the accumulation process is also marked by competition among capitalists. As each capitalist seeks to maximize profits, they are forced to invest in new technologies and increase productivity to stay competitive. This competition drives innovation and the reorganization of labor, increasing the concentration of capital in the hands of a few. Competition among capitalists has counterproductive effects for workers. As capitalists seek to improve efficiency and reduce costs, workers are increasingly displaced by technology, leading to a reduction in the number of jobs and an intensification of exploitation. Competition also leads to a tendency toward the concentration of capital, as larger capitalists are better able to exploit economies of scale. The concentration of capital and the destruction of small businesses. One of the most important effects of the accumulation process is the concentration of capital. As capitalists reinvest their profits, those with more resources are able to expand their operations more quickly than smaller ones. This leads to the concentration of capital in the hands of a small number of large firms, which can dominate entire sectors of the economy. Small businesses, on the other hand, are suffocated by competition and are often absorbed by the larger ones. This concentration of capital is a key feature of capitalism, as it produces growing inequality among capitalists and reduces competition in the market, which in turn can lead to the formation of monopolies or large business conglomerates. Social inequality and capital accumulation. Capital accumulation not only benefits capitalists but also generates growing social inequality. As capital concentrates in the hands of a few, the gap between the rich and the poor widens. Capitalists accumulate increasing wealth, while workers continue to receive low wages and are exploited in the production process. Marx argues that this inequality is an inherent feature of capitalism. The system is designed for one class, the capitalist class, to accumulate wealth at the expense of the other, the working class. Capital accumulation, therefore, is not just a matter of economic expansion but also of the concentration of power and resources, reinforcing social hierarchies. The accumulation process and economic crises. Marx also links the accumulation process to the emergence of economic crises. As capital accumulates, contradictions within the system become more apparent. The increase in productivity and the intensification of competition can lead to overproduction, where the goods produced exceed demand in the market, leading to a crisis of overproduction. Additionally, the concentration of capital and growing social inequality create tensions within society. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a few capitalists while the working masses struggle to survive generates social and political conflicts. These structural contradictions of capitalism, according to Marx, are what cause the cyclical crises that characterize the system. The primitive accumulation of capital. Marx also discusses the concept of the primitive accumulation of capital, which refers to the early stages in which capital accumulates in large quantities. In its early years, capitalism was not only sustained by the exploitation of labor but also by the expropriation of land, colonization, and the appropriation of wealth from non-capitalist peoples. Primitive accumulation was the process that allowed capitalists to establish an initial capital base that would later be reinvested in production. The primitive accumulation of capital was, therefore, a violent process of dispossession of land and resources, which created the necessary conditions for the development of modern capitalism. Conclusion. This chapter on the capitalist and the accumulation process is fundamental to understanding how capitalism perpetuates itself. Capital accumulation is the engine of the capitalist system, as it allows for the continuous expansion of production and the generation of surplus value. Through the reinvestment of profits and the intensification of labor exploitation, capitalists accumulate wealth. However, this process also leads to the concentration of capital, social inequality, and economic crises, demonstrating the inherent contradictions of the capitalist system. Capital accumulation, while generating economic growth, also produces tensions and crises, which Marx considers an inevitable feature of capitalism. The class struggle and the internal contradictions of the system are, according to him, what will eventually lead to the transformation of capitalism into a different system. Chapter 12. The Class Struggle and Capital. In this chapter, Marx examines the fundamental role of class struggle within the capitalist system. For Marx, capitalism is not just an economic system but also a system deeply marked by class conflicts, as it is based on the exploitation of the working class by the capitalist class. Class struggle, according to Marx, is the engine of history and the key to understanding how capitalist societies develop. This chapter also highlights the inherent contradictions of the system and how these contradictions lead to social tensions and, eventually, to political and economic transformations. Class struggle as the engine of history. Marx argues that the history of all societies up to the present is the history of class struggle. Each mode of production is defined by a specific relationship between the classes that make it up, and the tensions and conflicts between these classes are what drive historical change. In the case of capitalism, class struggle takes place between the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, which owns the means of production, and the proletariat, the working class, which does not own the means of production and must sell its labor power to survive. The capitalist system, according to Marx, is intrinsically based on the exploitation of workers. The capitalist, by owning the means of production, controls the labor process and benefits from the surplus value generated by workers. The worker, on the other hand, is forced to sell their labor power in exchange for a wage, which places them in a position of subordination and dependence. Social classes in capitalism. In capitalist society, Marx identifies two main classes. The bourgeoisie, this is the capitalist class that owns the means of production. The bourgeoisie controls capital, factories, land, and machines, and is the dominant class in the capitalist system. Their power is based on their control over the labor of workers, as they extract surplus value from the working class's labor power. The proletariat, this is the working class that does not own the means of production and, therefore, is forced to sell its labor power to capitalists. Workers do not have control over the production process or the products they create. The proletariat is exploited by the bourgeoisie, as they produce more value than they receive in wages. Marx observes that these two classes are in constant conflict. The bourgeoisie seeks to maximize profits by exploiting workers, while the proletariat fights for better working conditions, higher wages, and a greater share of the fruits of their labor. Exploitation and alienation of labor. The exploitation of the working class is a central aspect of class struggle in capitalism. Marx explains that capitalism is structured so that the capitalist appropriates the labor of workers, extracting more value than they pay them. This appropriation of surplus value is the basis of the bourgeoisie's wealth and the working class's poverty. Additionally, Marx introduces the concept of alienation in this context. Alienation refers to the disconnection that workers experience from the product of their labor, the labor process, and their own being. In capitalism, workers have no control over what they produce or how work is organized. The worker becomes a mere commodity, and work, rather than being a creative activity, becomes a means for survival. Alienation, according to Marx, is an inherent characteristic of capitalism, as the worker is separated from the fruits of their labor and from humanity itself. Class struggle, in this sense, is also a struggle for the liberation of the worker from their alienation. Class struggle and revolution. Marx believes that class struggle in capitalism is inevitable. As the contradictions of the capitalist system intensify, the proletariat will become aware of its exploitation and will organize a struggle to end the capitalist system. This struggle will eventually lead to the proletarian revolution, where the working class will take control of the means of production and abolish social classes, eliminating exploitation and alienation. For Marx, the proletarian revolution marks the end of capitalism and the beginning of a new form of social organization, socialism. In socialism, workers will own the means of production, and production will be organized to meet human needs, not to generate profits. The state, which in capitalism is a tool of the bourgeoisie to maintain its dominance, will transform into a tool of the workers for the creation of a classless society. Ideology and the power of the bourgeoisie. Marx also addresses how ideology plays a crucial role in class struggle. The dominant ideology in capitalist society is the ideology of the bourgeoisie, which justifies its dominance over the proletariat. Through education, media, and state institutions, the bourgeoisie perpetuates ideas that present exploitation as something natural or inevitable. Marx argues that the dominant ideology serves to conceal the contradictions of the capitalist system and prevents workers from recognizing their subordinated position. Class struggle, therefore, is not only economic but also ideological. The proletariat must free itself from the ideas that justify its exploitation and become aware of its historical role in the transformation of society. Class struggle and global capitalism. Marx also recognizes that capitalism is not a phenomenon limited to one country but is a global system. The capitalist constantly seeks to expand markets and maximize production, leading to imperialism and the exploitation of non-capitalist peoples. Class struggle, therefore, is not only a struggle within a country but also an international struggle against the domination of capital. As capitalism spreads across the world, it creates a global working class with common interests, which will eventually unite to fight against the international bourgeoisie. Conclusion: class struggle is the engine of historical development and social transformation in capitalism. Marx maintains that the conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat is an inherent feature of the capitalist system, and this conflict will inevitably lead to the proletarian revolution. The bourgeoisie's ideology, which justifies its dominance, can only be defeated when the proletariat becomes aware of its exploitation and fights for the transformation of society. Class struggle is, for Marx, not only an economic struggle but also an ideological and political struggle. The triumph of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie will bring about the creation of a classless society, without exploitation and without alienation, where the means of production are collectively owned and oriented towards satisfying human needs. Chapter 13: Property and Capital. In this chapter, Marx analyzes the relationship between property and capital, highlighting how private ownership of the means of production is fundamental to the existence of the capitalist system. Marx argues that private property is not a natural right but a social construct closely tied to the accumulation of capital and the exploitation of the working class. Throughout this chapter, the ways in which private property of capital sustains the system of exploitation and the inherent inequalities of capitalism are examined. Private property and capital. Marx begins the chapter by stating that private property is the foundation upon which capitalism is structured. In capitalist society, the means of production, the land, factories, machines, etc., are owned by one class, the bourgeoisie, while the working class, the proletariat, owns nothing but their labor power. This relationship of property is fundamental to the functioning of the capitalist system, as it allows capitalists to appropriate the value produced by workers. Private ownership of the means of production enables the capitalist class to obtain surplus value, that is, the additional value created by workers that is not paid to them in the form of wages. The capitalist's ability to appropriate this additional value is based on their control over property, which grants them the power to organize and control production. The role of capital in private property. Marx argues that capital is, ultimately, private property that generates value. Capital is not just money, but a social relationship rooted in private ownership of the means of production. By owning capital, capitalists control the production process and the distribution of wealth. Capital is thus a means of continuous expansion, seeking to generate more wealth through the exploitation of labor. The process of capital accumulation, that is, the investment and reinvestment of profits to increase capital, is intrinsically linked to private property. Capitalists seek to maximize profits by intensifying labor exploitation and reinvesting profits in the expansion of production. Private property and exploitation. The relationship between private property and the exploitation of the working class is central to Marx's theory. Capitalists acquire their wealth not only through the sale of commodities but by appropriating the value created by workers. In a capitalist system, workers do not receive the full value of their labor. Instead, the capitalist keeps the difference, which is surplus value. Private property of the means of production is the means by which capitalists exercise this exploitation. Marx points out that private property is the basis of alienation in capitalism. Workers are not only stripped of the fruits of their labor but are also alienated from the production process. They have no control over what they produce or how production is organized. Private property concentrates economic power in the hands of a few, while workers are dispossessed of any power over their work and their lives. Concentration of property and capital accumulation. As capitalism progresses, private property tends to concentrate in the hands of a few capitalists, leading to the monopolization of capital. Larger capitalists, those who can afford to invest in new technologies and expand their operations, absorb smaller ones, thereby increasing their control over production and the market. Marx observes that this process of capital concentration generates greater inequality in society. The wealthiest capitalists grow richer while smaller property owners and workers are displaced or impoverished. The concentration of property increases the gap between social classes and reinforces power hierarchies in capitalism. The concentration of property also impacts competition. As property is concentrated in the hands of a few capitalists, market competition decreases, which can lead to the formation of monopolies. Monopolies, according to Marx, are a manifestation of concentrated power in capitalism, allowing large companies to control the market, set prices, and increase profits without worrying about competition. Private property and social inequality. Marx emphasizes that private property not only creates economic inequalities but also impacts social relationships. Private ownership of the means of production means that capitalists have power not only over labor but also over social, political, and cultural life. The bourgeoisie, as the dominant class, uses its economic power to influence state institutions, the media, and educational structures, allowing it to maintain its dominance over the working class. Private property also creates a divided society, in which the interests of capitalists and workers are in constant conflict. Class struggle, which Marx describes as the engine of history, is a struggle for the redistribution of property and power. The abolition of private property in the means of production, according to Marx, is key to overcoming exploitation and inequality in capitalism. Abolition of private property. The abolition of private property is one of Marx's key proposals for transforming capitalist society. Marx is not advocating for the abolition of private property in general, but for the abolition of private property of the means of production. Instead of capitalists controlling production, Marx proposes that the means of production be collectively owned by the workers. This would eliminate the basis of exploitation and allow for the creation of a classless society where resources are distributed according to needs and not according to the ability to generate profits. The abolition of private property of the means of production would allow workers to take control of their labor and the products they create. Marx believes this would lead to a fairer and more equitable society, where workers would not be alienated from their labor and social relations would be based on cooperation rather than competition and exploitation. Conclusion. In this chapter, Marx explains how private property is the foundation of capitalism, as it allows capitalists to exercise control over production and extract surplus value from the labor of workers. The concentration of property and capital accumulation create growing inequality and reinforce power hierarchies. The struggle for the redistribution of property and the abolition of private property of the means of production is, according to Marx, a fundamental part of the class struggle and the path toward a classless society, where workers control the means of production and wealth is distributed equitably. Marx concludes that the transformation of the capitalist system is only possible through the overcoming of private property of the means of production, which would eliminate the exploitation and alienation that characterize capitalism. Chapter 14. The Circulation of Capital. In this chapter, Marx addresses the process of the circulation of capital, which is the cycle through which capital passes through different forms to produce value. Circulation is the process by which capital moves, is invested in production, becomes commodities, and is sold to generate profits. Marx highlights how this cycle of circulation is fundamental to the reproduction of the capitalist system, as it allows for the continuous accumulation of capital. The cycle of capital. Marx describes the basic cycle of capital in terms of three stages. Money commodity. The capitalist begins with a certain amount of money, which is used to buy commodities. This includes purchasing labor power, workers, and the means of production, machinery, materials, etc. Here, money is transformed into commodities to begin the production process. Commodity, production, commodity. Once the commodities are acquired, the capitalist uses them in the production process. Human labor is transformed into commodities through work, which is the only factor that generates new value. During this process, labor produces a value greater than the cost of the labor power employed, surplus value, which becomes the added value to the commodities. Commodity money. After the commodities have been produced, the capitalist puts them on the market for sale. By selling them, the capitalist obtains money, and the sale generates a profit, money, completing the cycle. The money initially invested becomes more money, allowing the capitalist to reinvest the capital and continue expanding the process of accumulation. This cycle of money-commodity money is the foundation of the capitalist system. Simply put, the capitalist starts with money, buys what is needed to produce commodities, and then sells those commodities for more money, generating profit in the process. This cycle is self-contained and repeats, allowing capital to accumulate continuously. The realization of value and the sale of commodities. Marx emphasizes that the main objective of capital circulation is the realization of value. The value created during the production process only becomes effective once the commodities are sold in the market. The capitalist invests in the production of commodities with the hope of selling them at a price that exceeds the cost of production, thus generating a profit. The circulation process involves the realization of the value of commodities through exchange in the market. However, this exchange is not a neutral process. It is determined by power relations between social classes, with capitalists controlling the means of production and workers being dependent on the sale of their labor power. Marx points out that the realization of value does not occur automatically in the market, but depends on demand and market conditions. If production exceeds the demand for commodities, the capitalist may face a crisis of overproduction, which reduces profitability and can lead to an economic slowdown. The role of money in the circulation of capital. Marx underscores that, in the capitalist system, money plays an essential role in the circulation of capital. It is not only a medium of exchange but also functions as a vehicle that allows the capitalist to transform value and accumulate more capital. Money is the way in which value is realized in the capitalist economy, and the cycle of money-commodity money reflects how the capitalist seeks to transform money into more money. Money also acts as a measure of the value of commodities, facilitating the exchange between different types of goods and services. Without money as a medium of exchange, it would be impossible to carry out the transactions necessary for capital to flow and accumulate in the capitalist system. The accumulation and growth of capital. Marx argues that the circulation of capital not only involves the sale of commodities and the obtaining of profits but also leads to the growth of capital. The accumulation of capital is the process by which the capitalist reinvests the profits obtained from the sale of commodities to expand production. As the capitalist accumulates more capital, they can invest in more means of production, hire more workers, and increase the production of commodities. This process of expansion is fundamental to capitalism, as the system is oriented towards continuous accumulation. The capitalist does not merely seek to recover their initial investment but also to generate more capital to reinvest and continue expanding the production cycle. The accumulation of capital is, therefore, the driving force of the capitalist system, enabling the constant expansion of production and the accumulation of wealth. Crises in the circulation of capital. Marx points out that the circulation of capital is not a linear process and is often marked by economic crises. These crises can occur when production exceeds market demand, leading to overproduction of commodities. Overproduction causes prices to fall, reducing profitability and potentially leading to an economic slowdown or even a recession. The crisis in the circulation of capital can also be caused by a lack of investment in the economy or low profitability of investments. When capitalists cannot find profitable ways to reinvest their profits, the accumulation cycle slows down and may lead to a crisis of overaccumulation of capital. Marx believes that these crises are inherent to the capitalist system and are a manifestation of the system's structural contradictions. Production is oriented towards the infinite accumulation of capital, but market limitations and class relations create tensions that eventually lead to economic crises. Capital and globalization. Marx also observes that, as capitalism expands, the circulation of capital transcends national borders. Capital is not limited to one country but continually seeks to expand worldwide. This globalization of capital creates a global market in which capitalists seek to maximize their profits by exploiting resources and labor worldwide. The global expansion of capital also leads to increased competition among international capitalists, intensifying tensions within the capitalist system. As markets become saturated, capitalists seek new ways to exploit resources and labor in non-capitalist countries, often resulting in imperialism and colonialism. Conclusion. The circulation of capital is a crucial process for the reproduction and expansion of capitalism. Through the cycle of money-commodity money, the capitalist seeks to transform their money into more money, generating profits and accumulating capital. This process is not linear but is marked by economic crises resulting from the inherent contradictions of the system. The circulation of capital is also global, reflecting the expansive nature of capitalism and the tensions generated by international competition. Although the circulation of capital facilitates the expansion of production and the accumulation of wealth, it also demonstrates the contradictions of capitalism, which ultimately lead to cyclical crises and the concentration of capital in the hands of a few. Chapter 15. The Production of Productive Forces. In this chapter, Marx examines how the production of productive forces is a key driver in the development and expansion of capitalism. The production of productive forces refers to society's capacity to produce goods and services, which is determined by tools, technology, and the organization of labor. Marx focuses on how technological innovations and the organization of labor under capitalism alter production relations, the economic structure, and the living conditions of the working classes. The productive force in capitalism. The productive forces, according to Marx, are the means and processes through which human labor transforms nature and produces goods and services. These forces include both the means of production, land, machinery, tools, etc., and labor power, workers and their skills. Marx argues that under capitalism, productive forces develop rapidly due to competition among capitalists, the pursuit of higher productivity, and the constant reinvestment of profits in the expansion of production. However, although the productive forces develop and grow under capitalism, this development is linked to the relations of production. Under capitalism, productive forces are used in ways that increase capital accumulation and the exploitation of the working class. Technological innovations are not necessarily implemented to improve people's living conditions, but to maximize profits and efficiency in production. Technological innovation and its impact on capitalism. One of the most obvious ways in which the productive forces develop is through technological innovation. The introduction of new machines, tools, and production methods increases production efficiency, allowing more goods to be produced in less time and at a lower cost. Capitalists, seeking to reduce costs and increase productivity, constantly invest in technological innovations. Marx notes that these innovations are not neutral, they are driven by class relations. Capitalists seek to maximize surplus value and profits through automation and mechanization, which leads to a reduction in human labor in production. This replacement of labor with machinery has significant consequences for the working class, as workers lose jobs and their purchasing power is affected, even though the productive forces increase production capacity. The conflict between productive forces and relations of production. Marx introduces the idea that the development of productive forces comes into conflict with the relations of production in capitalism. As productive forces develop, they require a more advanced social organization to effectively harness their potential. However, in the capitalist system, the relations of production are designed to benefit capitalists, limiting the rational use of productive forces for the benefit of the majority of society. This conflict becomes a structural contradiction within capitalism. As the productive forces advance, the relations of production become obsolete, as they are unable to efficiently manage new forms of production and distribution. This mismatch between productive forces and relations of production is one of the reasons why Marx predicts that capitalism is doomed to enter a crisis and be replaced by a new form of economic organization: alienation and the production of productive forces. Marx also addresses how the development of productive forces under capitalism leads to the alienation of the worker. As technology and machinery are integrated into the production process, workers become mere links in a productive chain, losing control over their work and creativity. Instead of owning the means of production, workers are reduced to mere employees operating machines, which increases alienation. Alienation manifests in several ways. The worker is alienated from their product, as they have no control over what they produce or how production is organized. They are alienated from the process of work, as their labor becomes a repetitive and monotonous activity, and they are alienated from themselves, as they cannot fully realize themselves in their work, since they are subjected to the demands of capital. The centralization of capital and the accumulation process. The expansion of productive forces also leads to the centralization of capital. As businesses grow and productive forces develop, large capitalists who have access to the most advanced resources and technology can absorb smaller businesses. The centralization of capital leads to the creation of monopolies and oligopolies, where a few large capitalists control most of the production and distribution of commodities. Marx points out that the centralization of capital not only increases economic inequality but also reinforces the control of the bourgeoisie over society. As capital concentration increases, the capitalist class becomes more powerful and can influence government policies, labor laws, and other social institutions to protect their interests. The future of productive forces and revolution. Marx argues that the development of productive forces, combined with the contradictions of capitalism, will eventually lead to a radical transformation of society. The development of productive forces has created a material base for a classless society, but capitalist relations of production remain an obstacle to the full development of these forces. Socialism arises as the solution to this conflict. According to Marx, when productive forces reach their highest level of development under capitalism, existing relations of production become a barrier to progress. At this point, the working class, organized through class struggle, will take control of the means of production and abolish capitalism, allowing productive forces to develop freely for the benefit of all society. Conclusion. The chapter on the production of productive forces is essential for understanding how capitalism drives economic development through technological innovation and the expansion of productive capacity. However, it also reveals the fundamental contradictions of the system, as capitalist relations of production limit the full potential of productive forces and generate alienation, exploitation, and inequality. Marx predicts that, due to these contradictions, capitalism is doomed to enter into crisis and be replaced by a socialist system that allows for the rational organization of productive forces and the equitable distribution of wealth. Chapter 16. Capital in Agricultural Production. In this chapter, Marx analyzes how capital is applied in agricultural production and how the laws of capitalism affect agriculture. Although the agricultural sector is fundamental to the economy, the way it operates under the capitalist system reflects the same dynamics of exploitation and capital concentration that exist in industry. Marx examines how private land ownership and the exploitation of labor in agriculture are key to understanding the contradictions of capitalism. Agriculture and the capitalization of the countryside. Marx begins this chapter by pointing out that, although agriculture seems to be a distinct sector from industry, it is increasingly subject to the same laws of capitalism that govern industrial production. Capital, which initially focused on factories and industry, begins to shift to the countryside as agriculture becomes capitalized. Through investments in land, machinery, and agricultural techniques, the capitalist seeks to maximize labor productivity in the countryside, in the same way that it is done in industry. The same relations of exploitation and accumulation that exist in factories apply to agriculture, where the goal is to obtain the maximum output from rural workers, who produce more value than they receive in wages. Land ownership and agricultural exploitation. One of the main aspects Marx addresses in this chapter is the role of private land ownership in capitalist agriculture. Just as in industry, where capitalists own the means of production, in agriculture, landowners control the land and natural resources. Land is a productive asset, and ownership of it gives the capitalist the power to extract surplus value from rural workers. In agricultural capitalism, workers do not own the land they cultivate and therefore are forced to sell their labor power to landowners or agricultural capitalists. These, in turn, seek to maximize their profits through labor exploitation and the intensification of production. As in industry, the capitalist extracts surplus value when workers produce more value than they receive in wages. The impact of mechanization on agriculture. As capitalism develops, so does the mechanization of agriculture. Marx observes how capital invests in agricultural machinery that increases productivity but also reduces the amount of labor required in the countryside. Mechanization is, in fact, a reflection of the same trends observed in industry. Capital seeks to reduce labor costs by replacing human labor with machinery. This process of mechanization increases the concentration of capital in agriculture, as only large landowners or capitalists who can afford to invest in machinery can compete in a capitalist market. Small farmers and landowners who cannot access these technological advances are displaced or absorbed by the larger ones, leading to greater concentration of land ownership. Exploitation of the peasantry and the concentration of land. Marx also highlights how the process of capitalizing agriculture contributes to the concentration of land in the hands of a few landowners or agricultural corporations. As capital shifts to the countryside, small agricultural operations are unable to compete with large landowners who use advanced machinery and more efficient production methods. This generates growing inequality between large landowners and small farmers. The concentration of land in the hands of a few capitalists reinforces social hierarchies in the countryside and contributes to the exploitation of the peasantry. Rural workers, who are often employed by large landowners or work in precarious conditions on rented land, have no control over the means of production or the product of their labor. Capital accumulation and agriculture. Marx argues that the process of capital accumulation in agriculture follows the same principles as in industry. Capitalists reinvest the profits made from the sale of agricultural products into the expansion of production. This may involve buying more land, acquiring new machines, or hiring more workers. Capital accumulation in agriculture also involves a process of commercialization of agricultural products. Products that were once consumed locally or by the farmer themselves are now produced to be sold in global markets. This shift reflects the global expansion of capitalism, in which agricultural products are exchanged internationally, subjecting farmers to fluctuations in the global market. Land and monopolization in agriculture. Marx observes that agricultural capitalism also leads to land monopolization. Large landowners and agricultural corporations benefit from mechanization and the expansion of production, while small landowners and farmers are displaced. This process of monopolization is a manifestation of the capitalist principle of wealth concentration, which leads to greater inequality in the distribution of land and resources. The monopolization of land also implies that labor relations in agriculture are transformed. Instead of the peasant autonomy that existed in pre-capitalist forms of production, agricultural workers now become employees of large capitalists, with no power over the production process or the land they work. The future of capitalist agriculture. Marx predicts that capitalism will continue to expand in agriculture, leading to greater concentration of land and resources in the hands of a few. This process will contribute to the proliferation of agricultural crises, as production for sale in global markets will be subject to fluctuations in supply and demand. Moreover, the process of mechanization will continue to reduce the need for labor, increasing inequality and deepening the exploitation of rural workers. However, Marx also sees this process as an opportunity for change. As agrarian capitalism expands and creates a more class-conscious rural working class, a revolutionary movement may emerge that challenges property relations in agriculture and seeks a reorganization of production and land distribution. Conclusion. The chapter on capital production in agriculture shows how capitalism applies the same laws of exploitation and accumulation as in industry. Through private land ownership, mechanization, and capital concentration, agrarian capitalism not only generates greater exploitation of rural workers but also increasing inequality and land monopolization. The contradictions of this system, just like in industry, lead to periodic crises and greater concentration of wealth. Marx sees these contradictions as the driving force behind an eventual social change, where rural workers, just like urban ones, will fight for control over the means of production and the redistribution of land. For Marx, transforming property relations in agriculture will be a fundamental part of the socialist revolution. Chapter 17. The Role of the State in the Capitalist Economy. In this chapter, Marx examines the role of the state in the capitalist system, pointing out that the state is not a neutral entity but a tool of the ruling class to maintain its power and control the class struggle. Marx emphasizes that, in a capitalist system, the state primarily acts in defense of the interests of the bourgeoisie, that is, the capitalist class that controls the means of production, and its function is to ensure the reproduction of the social and economic order based on exploitation. The state as an instrument of the ruling class. Marx begins the chapter by stating that the state is not above social classes, nor does it act for the benefit of society as a whole. Instead of being an impartial institution mediating between the interests of all classes, the state is, in its essence, a tool for the domination of the capitalist class. The state protects the interests of the bourgeoisie and ensures that the conditions for capital accumulation remain intact. In this sense, the state is the management committee of the ruling class's interests. The state uses laws, the judicial system, armed forces, police, and other institutions to ensure that capitalist property relations are maintained and to repress any challenge to the established social order. The role of the state in capital accumulation. Marx notes that the state has a crucial role in capital accumulation. For capitalism to function efficiently, the state must create and maintain the conditions that allow capital to circulate, provide access to markets, and reproduce the labor force. This includes building infrastructures, regulating the labor market, and protecting the interests of capitalists at both national and international levels. Additionally, the state also plays a role in externalizing the social costs of capitalism. It is the state that takes responsibility for providing public services, such as education, healthcare, social security, and infrastructure, which are necessary for the functioning of the capitalist economy but are not directly profitable for capitalists. In this way, the state indirectly subsidizes the reproduction of the labor force and ensures that the capitalist system continues to function without interruptions. The illusion of state neutrality. A central aspect of Marx's analysis is the critique of the illusion of state neutrality. In capitalist democracies, the state is presented as an impartial institution acting for the benefit of society as a whole, protecting the rights and welfare of all social classes. However, Marx argues that this is a false consciousness that conceals the reality of class struggle. The state, while appearing neutral, always favors the interests of the capitalist class. For example, laws protecting private property, contracts, and the market system are seen as fair and natural, but they are, in fact, laws that benefit the owners of the means of production and ensure the continuity of labor exploitation. Through its legal and political apparatus, the state organizes and legitimizes the unequal distribution of wealth, thus maintaining capitalist domination over workers. The state and the reproduction of the labor force. The state also plays a crucial role in the reproduction of the labor force. The capitalist class needs workers to be educated, healthy, and trained to work, so the state assumes responsibility for public education, healthcare, and other forms of social welfare. However, these services are not provided altruistically. The state provides these services to ensure that workers are in a condition to keep working and producing value for capitalists. The educational system, for example, not only teaches useful knowledge for personal development but also trains individuals to meet the needs of the labor market, adapting to employers' requirements and learning to be obedient and productive workers. In this way, the state contributes to the exploitation process by ensuring that the labor force is available and ready to be used by capitalists. The state and capitalism's crises. Marx also addresses how the state responds to economic crises in capitalism. During times of crisis, the state intervenes to save the capitalist system from total disintegration. Often, this means rescuing large corporations or banks through fiscal and monetary policies, such as injecting public money or lowering interest rates. However, these interventions do not benefit the working class. In fact, crises often lead to cuts in public services, increased labor exploitation, and unemployment, which worsen the living conditions of workers. Marx argues that the state's function during capitalist crises is to ensure that the system continues to operate, even at the expense of the majority of the population's welfare. This reinforces its role as protector of capitalist interests, as state policies during crises always tend to favor capitalists over workers. The state and international exploitation. Finally, Marx observes that the state also plays an important role in the international context. Capitalist governments tend to expand capitalism beyond their national borders, securing new markets and resources. Imperialism, which is a natural extension of capitalism, is supported by the state, which uses its military, political, and economic power to establish control over other countries and regions, exploiting their natural resources and cheap labor. The state also organizes and coordinates relations between different capitalist states to ensure that the global trade system continues to operate in favor of capitalist powers. This imperialist role of the state is manifested, for example, in foreign policy, the creation of trade agreements, and the use of military force to protect the interests of multinational corporations. Conclusion. Marx concludes that the capitalist state is a tool of the ruling class, meant to preserve capitalist relations of production and protect the interests of the bourgeoisie. Although it presents itself as a neutral institution, the state always acts in the benefit of capitalists, guaranteeing the accumulation of capital and the reproduction of exploitation. The role of the state in the capitalist economy, according to Marx, is to keep the system functioning even at the expense of the working class, and to organize the legal and political apparatus to ensure the continuity of the social order based on exploitation. Therefore, the state cannot be reformed in a way that benefits everyone equally. For Marx, the only solution to eliminate the exploitation and oppression that the capitalist state sustains is a revolution that overthrows the capitalist system and establishes a new social and economic organization based on collective ownership and the abolition of classes. Chapter 18. The Primary Accumulation of Capital. In this chapter, Marx analyzes the concept of the primary accumulation of capital, a fundamental process from which the foundations of modern capitalism emerge. According to Marx, primary accumulation is not the result of accumulating wealth through the production and exchange of commodities, but a historical process of dispossession, violence, and expropriation, where capitalists initially accumulate capital without the need for a strictly productive process. This process has fundamental implications for the development of capitalism and its contradictions. The expropriation of the means of production. Marx begins the chapter by describing how primary accumulation of capital is linked to the process of expropriating the means of production. Before the rise of capitalism, most people in pre-capitalist societies were small producers, peasants, and artisans who owned their own means of production, such as land, tools, and products. However, capitalism did not arise from a process of peaceful accumulation but through a violent process of dispossession of these means of production. The mass expropriation of land and natural resources was a central process in primary accumulation. Marx argues that, as landowners and the ruling classes stripped peasants and artisans of their land and means of production, they were forced to sell their labor, thereby becoming proletarians. This process of expropriation allowed for the creation of a working class that would later be exploited by capitalists to generate more value. The dispossession of land and the accumulation of capital. Marx points out that one of the most important events in the primary accumulation of capital was the privatization of land in Europe, particularly during the process of enclosures in England. Through the appropriation of common lands and the transformation of land into private property, peasants were forced to abandon their means of subsistence and seek work in the new factories and capitalist agriculture. This process not only deprived peasants of land but also turned them into wage workers, who depended on their wages for survival. In addition to the expropriation of land, Marx also mentions the accumulation of capital through the plundering of natural resources in the colonies, where capitalist powers extracted precious metals, agricultural products, and forced labor. This plundering of resources and slavery in the colonies were fundamental for the early development of capitalism in Europe. The expropriation of the labor force. The expropriation of the means of production was not limited to land and natural resources but also extended to the expropriation of the labor force. Marx notes that workers were stripped of their independence and forced to sell their labor to capitalists, thus establishing the foundations of capitalist exploitation. Primary accumulation, then, not only involves the accumulation of capital but also the creation of a working class that, having no other resources to survive, is forced to work for a wage under the conditions dictated by capitalists. The process of dispossession of the means of production and the labor force was not something that occurred gradually or peacefully but was marked by class conflicts, repression, and violence. Peasants, artisans, and workers who were stripped of their livelihoods faced a series of retaliations, such as extreme poverty, criminalization, and displacement. The initiation of capitalism through violence. Marx emphasizes that primary accumulation is not a peaceful or natural process, but a violent one that involves the dispossession of the working classes. The concentration of property in the hands of a few capitalists was accompanied by a process of structural violence, such as wars, slavery, colonization, and agrarian reforms, which stripped the lower classes of their resources. This initial dispossession and violence were fundamental to the accumulation of wealth by the early capitalists, who then used this capital to further expand the capitalist system. Capitalism did not emerge simply from a process of commodity exchange and the accumulation of wealth in markets, but from a violent process of expropriation that laid the foundations for the accumulation and concentration of capital in the hands of an elite, while the majority of people were subordinated to wage labor. Colonization and imperialist plundering. Marx also makes an important observation about the role of colonization and imperialism in the primary accumulation of capital. Capitalist powers in Europe used the colonies as sources of natural resources and cheap labor. This process of imperialist plundering allowed capitalist powers to accumulate enormous amounts of capital, which was later invested in industrial development and the expansion of capitalism. The slave trade and the plundering of resources in the colonies were crucial for financing the growth of capitalism in Europe. Marx highlights that colonialism not only extracted material resources but also consolidated global inequality, as imperialist nations enriched themselves at the expense of the exploitation and suffering of colonized peoples. The continuity of primary accumulation in capitalism. Marx concludes that, although primary accumulation was a specific historical process, its effects are still present in the capitalist system. The dispossession of natural resources, the control of land, and the exploitation of the labor force continue to be fundamental to capitalism. Additionally, the crises of overproduction and the social inequalities that characterize the capitalist system are largely the result of this initial primary accumulation. The accumulation of capital and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few continue in the modern form of imperialism, where capitalist powers exploit less developed nations and accumulate resources to sustain their economic system. Conclusion. The chapter on the primary accumulation of capital is crucial for understanding how capitalism is established and developed through the violent expropriation of land, resources, and labor. Marx shows how capitalism is not a system that arose naturally or equitably, but from a process of dispossession and exploitation. This initial accumulation process is fundamental to the creation of a wealthy and powerful capitalist class and to the subordination of the working class, which remains exploited within the capitalist system. Marx emphasizes that, although primary accumulation may seem like a distant historical process, its effects are still present in the dynamics of accumulation and exploitation in modern capitalism, which continues to operate through mechanisms of dispossession, violence, and inequality. Chapter 19. The Concentration of Capital. In this chapter, Marx examines the process of capital concentration, a central phenomenon in the development of capitalism, which involves the accumulation of capital in the hands of a few large capitalists, while small capitalists are displaced or absorbed. The concentration of capital is one of the main contradictions of the capitalist system, as it contributes to economic and social inequality and intensifies class struggle. Marx describes how the concentration of capital not only affects the economy but also has profound political and social repercussions. The process of capital concentration. Marx begins the chapter by explaining that, in capitalism, the accumulation of capital is not an evenly distributed process among all capitalists. Over time, capital tends to concentrate in the hands of a few, leading to growing inequality in the distribution of wealth. The competition among capitalists to maximize their profits and accumulate more capital leads to the concentration of capital in the largest and most powerful companies. Capital concentration occurs primarily through two mechanisms. Absorption of small capitalists by larger ones. Larger capitalists, those with more resources and access to advanced technology, can buy or absorb smaller competitors who do not have the means to compete on a large scale. This process of monopolization eliminates competition and reduces the number of players in the market. Reinvestment of capital into expansion. Larger capitalists, by obtaining greater profits, have more resources to reinvest in production, allowing them to increase their size and control over the market. This leads to a greater centralization of production and the creation of large monopolies or conglomerates. Accumulation and concentration of capital. Marx points out that capital accumulation is the basis for capital concentration. As capitalists reinvest their profits to expand production and increase their competitiveness, capital tends to concentrate in the hands of a few. This process of capital concentration is essential for the functioning of capitalism, as it allows large capitalists to dominate the market, reduce production costs, and increase their profitability. However, Marx also observes that capital concentration leads to the destruction of small businesses. Smaller capitalists who lack access to advanced technology or resources to compete on a large scale are absorbed or impoverished by larger capitalists. This concentration process produces growing inequality, where a minority of capitalists control the majority of resources and wealth, while most workers and small business owners become increasingly impoverished. Monopolies and oligopolies. Marx describes how capital concentration leads to the formation of monopolies and oligopolies, where a few companies control the entire market for a particular good or service. These monopolies have the power to set prices, control production, and manipulate market conditions in their favor, allowing them to generate large profits without worrying about competition. The formation of monopolies also has political implications, as large companies have significant power over the state and society. Monopolies can influence political, legislative, and regulatory decisions, ensuring that the economic system continues to favor large capitalists and maintain wealth concentration. Social and political implications of capital concentration. Marx emphasizes that capital concentration affects not only the economy but also social relations and the power structure in society. As capital concentrates in the hands of a few, the gap between the rich and poor widens, generating social tensions and conflicts. The working class, displaced by automation and production concentration, becomes increasingly alienated and impoverished, while the capitalist class grows wealthier. Capital concentration also leads to greater concentration of power in the hands of large capitalists. By controlling much of the economy, monopolies have a significant influence on political and social decisions. The state, which in theory should represent all of society, becomes an instrument serving the interests of the largest capitalists, perpetuating inequalities and exploitation. Tendency toward imperialism and globalization. Marx also points out that capital concentration leads to the global expansion of capitalism. As large capitalists seek new markets for their goods, capitalism extends beyond national borders, leading to a process of imperialism. More developed capitalist countries seek to control resources and markets in non-capitalist countries, using both economic and military means to establish their dominance. The globalization of capital leads to greater interdependence among capitalist countries, intensifying global competition and increasing inequality between rich and poor countries. Imperialism allows large capitalist powers to continue accumulating capital at the expense of resources and cheap labor from colonized countries. The inherent contradiction of capital concentration. Marx argues that capital concentration creates a contradiction within the capitalist system. On one hand, capital concentration allows for greater efficiency and profitability through economies of scale, but on the other hand, it increases inequality and social polarization. This process leads to the destruction of competition, causing a crisis in the capitalist system, as the lack of competition can reduce innovation and the system's capacity for adaptation. Moreover, capital concentration creates growing inequality, where a few control the majority of resources and wealth, while most of the population becomes impoverished. This contradiction, according to Marx, is one of the factors that will lead to the collapse of capitalism and the eventual emergence of a new form of economic and social organization. Conclusion. In this chapter, Marx explains how capital concentration is an inherent characteristic of capitalism, leading to the monopolization of markets, increasing economic inequality, and a greater concentration of power in the hands of a few capitalists. As capital concentrates, social and political tensions intensify, reinforcing class struggle and setting the stage for a future economic crisis. The contradiction between the accumulation of wealth by a few and the growing poverty of the working masses is one of the fundamental contradictions of capitalism, which Marx sees as the driving force for social transformation toward a new system. Chapter 20. The Future of Capitalism. In this chapter, Marx reflects on the internal contradictions of capitalism and its long-term prospects. Through an analysis of the inherent trends within the capitalist system, Marx predicts that the contradictions of capitalism are not only inevitable but will lead to its eventual transformation. This chapter is crucial to understand how Marx views the future of capitalism and the possibility of a social revolution that overcomes this economic system based on exploitation. Inherent contradictions of capitalism. Marx begins the chapter by noting that capitalism is marked by a series of structural contradictions that make it unsustainable in the long run. Among the primary contradictions are the contradiction between labor and capital. Capitalism is based on the exploitation of labor, where capitalists appropriate the surplus value created by workers. However, this exploitation generates increasing social polarization, with wealth concentrated in the hands of a few capitalists and the growing misery of the working class. This contradiction drives class struggle, as workers seek to end their exploitation and demand a more equitable distribution of resources. The contradiction between social production and private appropriation. Capitalism promotes a socialized form of production, where goods and services are produced by a large number of workers who have no control over the means of production. However, the appropriation of the wealth generated by this labor is concentrated in private hands, resulting in an unequal distribution of resources. This contradiction between socialized production and private appropriation is one of the main tensions that, according to Marx, will lead to the collapse of the capitalist system. The contradiction between capital expansion and overproduction crises. The constant pursuit of capital accumulation leads to an unlimited expansion of production, but at the same time generates overproduction crises. This occurs when more goods are produced than the market can consume, resulting in a fall in prices and an economic crisis. These periodic crises are a characteristic of capitalism and reflect the system's inability to regulate itself. The law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Marx also revisits the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which holds that as capital accumulates and production becomes mechanized, the rate of profit tends to decrease. While mechanization and technological innovation can increase productivity, they also reduce the amount of living labor required to produce goods. Since labor is the only source of value, this reduces the value generated by each unit of invested capital, leading to a decline in profitability. The tendency of the rate of profit to fall is one of the main contradictions of capitalism, as it creates a tendency toward economic stagnation and cyclical crises. These crises are not just isolated episodes but manifestations of a structural contradiction that will make capitalism an increasingly incapable system of expanding without generating serious crises. The role of class struggle. Class struggle is a key factor in Marx's prediction about the future of capitalism. As the system's contradictions intensify, Marx anticipates that the working class will become increasingly aware of its exploitation and organization. Class struggle is not only economic but also ideological and political. Workers, recognizing their role in production and value creation, will organize to transform society and abolish capitalism. Marx sees revolution as a historical necessity. The working class, united in its struggle against the capitalists, will take control of the means of production and eliminate the exploitative relationships that characterize the capitalist system. The proletarian revolution, according to Marx, will be the historical act that ends capitalism and leads to the establishment of a new form of economic and social organization based on collective ownership of the means of production. Socialism and the end of capitalism. Marx not only analyzes the contradictions of capitalism but also describes socialism as the inevitable alternative. In Marx's vision, socialism would be a phase in which workers, as the dominant class, would take control of production and distribute resources based on human needs, not profitability. In this new system, labor would cease to be an alienating activity, and individuals would have control over their lives and work. Marx also sees socialism as a transitional phase toward communism, A classless society in which the means of production would be collectively owned and goods would be distributed according to each individual's needs. In communism, social classes and the state would disappear, as there would be no need for a repressive apparatus to maintain inequalities. The revolutionary process. The revolutionary process that Marx predicts will not be easy or peaceful. The capitalist class will fight to maintain its power, and the transition to socialism will require intense class struggle. Marx does not provide specific details on how this revolution will occur, but he argues that the development of productive forces and the growing polarization of wealth and power will make the revolution inevitable. The state, which in capitalism functions as a repressive apparatus, will transform during the revolutionary process. Marx suggests that during the transition phase, the proletariat will take control of the state, using it to dismantle capitalist structures and build a new society based on collective ownership and equitable distribution. The internationalization of the revolution. Marx also emphasizes that the proletarian revolution will not be a phenomenon limited to one country. Since capitalism is a global system, the revolution must also be international. Workers from all countries must unite in their struggle against capitalism and the bourgeoisie, as the triumph of the proletariat in one country cannot be consolidated without an international revolution. International solidarity is essential for the success of the revolution, as capitalism operates globally, and the working classes in different countries face the same problems of exploitation and oppression. The struggle for socialism must be a global struggle. Conclusion. Marx concludes that the future of capitalism is marked by its own internal contradictions, which will inevitably lead to its transformation. Class struggle, the crisis of overproduction, and the falling rate of profit are the forces that, in the long term, will destroy capitalism. Socialism, as a transitional phase toward communism, is the alternative that will emerge from class struggle and workers' awareness. Although capitalism may last for a time, it is destined to fall due to its structural contradictions. The proletarian revolution, led by a working class organized and conscious of its exploitation, will bring about the end of capitalism and the creation of a classless society, where resources are distributed according to human needs, not with the aim of maximizing profits. We have reached the end of this in-depth analysis of Capital by Karl Marx, a book that examines the contradictions and internal mechanisms of capitalism and predicts its eventual transformation. Throughout this journey, we have unraveled the processes of exploitation, accumulation, and concentration of capital, as well as class struggle, which Marx identified as the transformative force that will lead to a socialist society and eventually communism. If this content has been helpful in understanding the dynamics of capitalism and Marx's view of its future, we invite you to continue exploring more audiobooks and educational content. If you haven't subscribed yet, do so now to not miss any material on economics, philosophy, history, and much more. Remember that your subscription not only guarantees you access to more audiobooks but also supports the dissemination of content that fosters critical thinking and deep learning. Subscribe now and join us in the next chapter of knowledge and reflection. Thank you for listening.